From New York, this is Democracy Now!
They would be delusional if they think they can use him as a scapegoat and that the people will withdraw from the streets after he resigned. The people will continue. Our peaceful protests continue until we change the system that brought Adel Abdul Mahdi.
After 2 months of protests, Iraq's prime minister has resigned, but Iraqis are vowing to stay in the streets despite a bloody crackdown that's killed more than 400 people and injured 15,000. We'll go to Baghdad for the latest. Then, as President Trump heads to London for a NATO summit, we speak to Tariq Ali about the upcoming British elections.
The British Conservative Party has effectively been taken over by the extreme right wing inside that party. And they're waging a very right-wing campaign. On Brexit, their own position has changed from when they were threatening a no-deal Brexit to now accepting a compromise with the European Union.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The United Nations Climate Change Conference, known as COP25, is opening in Madrid, Spain today. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and 14 other Democratic lawmakers are part of a delegation to the summit. It was supposed to be held in Santiago, Chile, but the Chilean government canceled the conference amidst massive protests against economic inequality and austerity. Ahead of the summit's opening, scientists released a number of reports warning only drastic and unprecedented reductions in greenhouse gas emissions can avoid the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. May Bouvi, the head of 350.org, said the reports show, quote, "the science is screaming." This is UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaking ahead of the summit's opening.
What is still lacking is political will. Political will to put a price on carbon, political will to stop subsidies on fossil fuels, political will to stop building coal power plants from 2020 onwards, political will to shift taxation from income to carbon, taxing pollution instead of people. We simply have to stop digging and drilling and take advantage of the vast possibilities offered by renewable energy and nature-based solutions.
On Friday, hundreds of thousands of students walked out of schools across the world and took to the streets to demand urgent action to address the climate crisis. On Saturday, thousands of activists also protested at 3 coal mines in eastern Germany. And in Pakistan, Amnesty International has issued an unprecedented urgent action, saying Lahore's 10 million residents are at risk of having their health and human rights violated by hazardous smog that's engulfing Pakistan's second-largest city. Democracy Now! Will be broadcasting live from COP25 in Madrid, Spain, starting on Friday for a week. On Capitol Hill, the House Judiciary Committee will hold its first inquiry in the impeachment hearings Wednesday, December 4th. The hearing will feature legal experts testifying about the nature of impeachment and the constitutional standard for high crimes and misdemeanors. The impeachment hearings center on whether President Trump withheld military aid from Ukraine in order to pressure the Ukrainian president to investigate Trump's political rival, Joe Biden, and his son Hunter. The White House says neither President Trump nor his lawyer will attend Wednesday's Judiciary Committee hearing. The White House also tried to slander the impeachment process as unfair, even though the Democrats said inviting Trump or his lawyers to participate was an attempt to afford Trump due process. The House Intelligence Committee will also release its report this week, summarizing its investigation. 3 women have accused U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Gordon Sondland, of forcibly kissing them or exposing himself to them, then retaliating against them professionally after they rejected his unwanted and non-consensual sexual advances. All 3 accounts are from before Sondland, a wealthy Oregon hotel magnate, was named ambassador, a post he received after donating $1 million to Trump's inauguration. Trump himself has been accused of rape, sexual assault, or sexual harassment by more than 20 women. Anti-government protests are continuing in Iraq one day after the Iraqi parliament voted to accept the resignation of Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi, showing 2 months of protests against corruption, lack of jobs and basic services, and Iranian influence on Iraq. At least 400 people have been killed in the government's bloody crackdown against the ongoing protests. Iraq has also ordered 8 television broadcasters and 4 radio stations to close for allegedly violating media licensing rules. Last week, security forces raided the Baghdad office of Dilja TV. We'll have more on the protests in Iraq after headlines. In Malta, the Prime Minister, Joseph Muscat, has announced he'll resign in mid-January amidst the investigation into the murder of prominent investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, who was killed by a car bomb in 2017.
I
will write to the President of the Labour Party so that the process for a new leader is set for the 12th of January 2020. On that day, I will resign as leader of the Labour Party. In the days after, I will resign as a Prime Minister.
Malta's richest man, Jürgen Fenech, has been charged with complicity in the journalist's murder. He's been arrested in a separate money laundering case. The gambling tycoon is linked to Prime Minister Muscat's former chief of staff. Daphne Caruana Galizia's murder has rocked Malta, where thousands have taken to the streets to demand justice and accountability. She was one of Malta's most prominent journalists who investigated corruption at the highest levels. She also reported on the Panama Papers before her death. One of Jürgen Fenech's companies was listed in the Panama Papers, and Galizia reported on this company, 17 Black, before her murder. Meanwhile, in Egypt, security forces have arrested 3 more journalists, Salaf al-Salam, Hossam al-Sayed, and Mohammed Salah. Their arrests come after security forces raided the Cairo offices of Egypt's only independent media outlet, Madamasar, and arrested its staff members, who have since been released. And in Saudi Arabia, authorities arrested at least 7 journalists, bloggers, and columnists last month. In London, residents and officials gathered for a vigil today to mourn the deaths of 2 former Cambridge University students who were killed in a stabbing on London Bridge Friday in what's being called a terror attack. The 2 victims were 23-year-old Saskia Jones and 25-year-old Jack Merritt. Both had worked at the prison-based education project Learning Together. They'd gathered to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the program at Fishmongers Hall when the attack began. This is London Mayor Sadiq Khan speaking at a memorial service today.
The best way to defeat this hatred is not by turning on one another, but it's by focusing on the values that bind us, to take hope from the heroism of ordinary Londoners and our emergency services who ran towards danger, risking their lives to help people they didn't even know. And it's also by drawing inspiration from the lives of Jack and Saskia, who from an early age chose to dedicate themselves to helping others.
The attacker, Usman Khan, was convicted on terrorism-related charges in 2012 and had been released from prison last year. He was shot and killed by police after a Polish chef fought the attacker despite being repeatedly stabbed himself in order to allow other civilians time to escape. The attack has immediately become a major issue in the British elections set for December 12th. 10 days from now, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has called for longer prison sentences and is trying to blame the Labour Party for laws that allowed Khan to be released from prison. But family members of the attack's victims say they don't want their deaths politicized. Jack Merritt's father wrote on Twitter, quote, "My son Jack, who was killed in this attack, would not wish his death to be used as the pretext for more draconian sentences or for detaining people unnecessarily." Earlier this year, Jack Merritt spoke to the BBC about his work to help prisoners study law inside the Warren Hill prison in Suffolk.
Our students in prison often have a very first-hand, very real, but also very nuanced idea of how the law works. And also they have a very good sense of where there is a lack in information, where there is a lack in knowledge, and they really do know which areas of the law could do with clarification. And a lot of the time, these are areas that they have seen people go through the prison system not understanding, and they want to do research which will help people.
President Trump made an unexpected Thanksgiving visit to Afghanistan, where he announced he's reopening peace talks with the Taliban after he'd abruptly called off the talks in September. In his comments Thursday, Trump also claimed the U.S. is now demanding a ceasefire from the Taliban, a shift in the negotiating position that threw the U.S. strategy into turmoil. Trump's visit to Afghanistan came as Afghan officials say a U.S. drone strike killed 5 people after it struck a car that was rushing a mother to the hospital after she experienced complications from a home birth. The strike killed the 25-year-old mother, Malana, 3 of her relatives, and the car's driver in southeastern Afghanistan. The United States says it's investigating the reports of civilian casualties. The Pentagon previously claimed a strike in Khost province killed members of the Taliban. The U.S. Supreme Court slated to hear its first major gun case in nearly a decade. The justices will hear arguments today in a case over a New York City law that prohibited handgun owners from carrying their weapons anywhere other than 7 firing ranges inside the city limits. The law has since been changed. Justices will first consider whether the case is moot and should be thrown out because the restrictions have already been reversed. Twitter's permanently suspended the account of a potential challenger to Minnesota Democratic Congressmember Ilhan Omar after she called for Omar to be tried for treason and hanged in a now deleted tweet. Republican candidate Danielle Stella has been suspended for repeated violations of Twitter's rules. Congressmember Ilhan Omar has repeatedly received death threats, especially since President Trump tweeted about her last spring. 2 2020 presidential candidates have dropped out of the race, former Pennsylvania Congressmember Joe Sestak and Montana Governor Steve Bullock. Their departure leaves 16 candidates still vying to be Democratic nominees for the 2020 presidential race. In New York City, dozens of members of the environmental group Extinction Rebellion were arrested on Black Friday after hundreds of activists peacefully blocked an intersection in Herald Square in Midtown Manhattan, protesting Black Friday's consumerism. The action was part of multiple protests taking place around the globe against the climate crisis and capitalism. In France, dozens of activists protested outside Amazon's headquarters in Paris, while others formed a blockade at a shopping mall in Paris's business district. Another protest against Amazon also erupted in Germany. The protests came as Pope Francis condemned the virus of consumerism.
Dear brothers and sisters, consumerism is a virus that affects the faith at its root, because it makes you believe that life depends only on what you have. When you live for things, things are never enough. Greed grows and other people become obstacles in a race, and so one ends up feeling threatened and always dissatisfied and angry. The level of hatred rises.
And in Montgomery, Alabama, civil rights leader Rosa Parks was honored Sunday with a new statue in downtown Montgomery. 64 years ago, on December 1st, 1955, Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man and move to the back of the bus. Sunday also marked the 2nd annual Rosa Parks Day in Alabama. The Alabama state legislature approved the holiday last year. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Anti-government protests are continuing in Iraq, one day after the Iraqi parliament voted to accept the resignation of Prime Minister Adel Abdel-Mahdi following 2 months of protests against corruption, lack of jobs and basic services, as well as Iranian influence on Iraq. On Friday, fireworks were set off in Baghdad's Tahrir Square when Abdel-Mahdi announced his resignation, but protesters have vowed to stay in the streets.
We want to send a message that Adel Abdel-Mahdi's resignation doesn't solve the entire problem. He is only part of the problem, only a broken piece in a chess game. He is not the problem. The problem is about the system that brought us Adel Abdel-Mahdi. They would be delusional if they think they can use him as a scapegoat and that the people will withdraw from the streets after he resigned. The people will continue. Our peaceful protests continue until we change the system that brought Adel Abdel-Mahdi.
Iraqi Prime Minister Abdul-Mahdi resigned 2 days after Iraqi security forces killed at least 44 people in the southern cities of Nasiriyah and Najaf after the Iranian consulate was burned down Wednesday night. Following the bloody crackdown, Iraq's Shiite spiritual leader, Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, urged the Iraqi parliament to withdraw its support of the prime minister. Sistani warned the escalating violence could lead to a civil war in Iraq. More than 400 Iraqi protesters have been killed and 15,000 injured since the anti-government demonstrations began in October. When Abdul-Mahdi was officially resigned, he will keep serving as a caretaker in a caretaker government until a new one is formed. We go right now to Iraqi journalist Ghaith Abdul-Ahad. He's joining us from Baghdad, a correspondent for The Guardian newspaper. And here in New York, Sinan Antun is with us, poet, novelist, translator, and scholar born and raised in Baghdad, now associate professor at New York University. His most recent book, The Book of Collateral Damage. Ghaith, let's begin with you in Baghdad. Describe what's happened over these few days, and were you surprised that the prime minister has now resigned?
Well, Amy, I couldn't agree more than with the demonstrator you just interviewed. This is exactly the sentiment in the street. Adil Abdul-Mahdi is nothing but a figurehead, or as the demonstrator said, a piece of a chessboard. I was in the square earlier today. There are tens demonstrators, not that much of a clashes between demonstrators and the police force, because there's a sort of a kind of a ceasefire. But yes, they are willing to stay in the square and continue these demonstrations until a total change of this whole political system that they describe as a rotten, corrupt political system.
And describe the extent of the mass protests.
I mean, at this moment, it involves a majority of the Iraqis, and I don't mean only the youth that went to the square early on and they kind of like push against the security forces. I mean, now you have students, you have middle class, you have a large section of the society. What is most amazing about these demonstrations, it's the majority, if I may use some sectarian terms, it's the majority Shia population of Baghdad that spearheaded these demonstrations. So every opposition to this government of Baghdad in the last decade and a half have been spearheaded, let's say, by people who rejected this political system. So let's say the Sunnis or Qaeda or whatever. At this moment, this is a popular movement calling for social democracy. This is why neither the political system nor the militias or the pro-Iranian camps could label those guys as, whatever, ISIS or Qaeda, as they used to do before, because this is the backbone of this regime. Those kids, many of them did fight for this government against ISIS. They were volunteers in the front. But when the threat of ISIS was over, when they came back to their villages and towns and neighborhoods, be it in Baghdad, be it in the south, and they realized that this political system, those militia commanders, the party apparatchiks, so corrupt, been building this massive wealth, and that's what created the spark for this revolution. It's the injustice of this current political system in Baghdad.
And can you describe what has taken place in both Najaf and Nasiriyah, Ghaith?
Amy, I was in Nasiriyah, went there kind of a few weeks ago, and I've seen the situation on the ground. Unlike in Baghdad, where it's a demonstration against a political regime, let's say, in Nasiriyah, in the towns in the south, in Najaf also, it is more personal. These are small towns. They know who joined the political party, who benefited, who became very wealthy since joining the parliament or joining a militia. So it's more personal. The violence is also very personal, because in the south you have a certain militia dominating a certain security force. The reaction of the security forces was very brutal. I mean, 48 people, I think, were killed both in Nasiriyah and Najaf. In return, the demonstrators can target the houses of those, or the symbols of this corruption. So in a small town in Shatra, where I was a few weeks ago, they go around and they burn the houses of MPs because that's for them the symbol of corruption. In Najaf, the demonstrations are taking place first against the Iranian consulate, a huge setback for the Iranian influence in Iraq. Second, against the shrine of a very revered, again, Shia cleric who is part of this establishment, who's dead, so his shrine. So in these places, it's more personal, and the reaction is far more violent than in Baghdad.
We're going to break and then come back to this discussion. In addition to Ghaith Abdullah Ahad, who is joining us from Baghdad, Iraq, we're joined by the Iraqi-born poet, writer, novelist Sinan Antoon. Stay with us. Music by Nasir Shamma. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. As we continue to look at what's happening in Iraq, more than 400 protesters killed. The Prime Minister has now acquiesced and said he is resigning. I want to turn right now to a representative of Iraq's top Shiite Muslim cleric, Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, speaking Friday.
We confirm again that attacks against peaceful protesters are forbidden, as well as them being prevented from having the right to demand reforms. We also confirm that attacking private and public property is forbidden, and that property should not be left to be attacked by infiltrators and their allies.
We're joined by Sinan Antoon, the translator, novelist, author, now a professor at New York University, Baghdad-born, Iraqi-raised, and Ghaith Abdullah Ahad, correspondent for the Guardian newspaper, speaking to us from Baghdad, Iraq. Sinan Antoon, if you could respond to Sistani, and also to, we just had you in last week when hundreds of protesters had been killed, but you were also talking about the significance of this mass protest. Now, one of their demands, the resignation of the Prime Minister, has been met.
Yes, I mean, about Sistani, Sistani is a revered figure for many Shiites, not only in Iraq, but all over the world. And the problem is with Sistani's representatives who are speaking, who are themselves, for many of the protesters, part of this political system and implicated in the corruption. And Sistani himself, his statements have been read as being actually responding to the pressure from the protesters themselves, because many of the protesters in previous weeks have demanded that Sistani issue a fatwa, an edict declaring that it is unlawful to kill the protesters. So, so the resignation does not mean a lot to the protesters themselves. One of the signs that I saw this morning said, basically, we tell them that the car is broken down and they change the driver. So these protests are against the entire political system, against the political culture that has reigned since 2003, against the script and against all of the political class, and the demands from most of the protesters that the new Prime Minister be someone from outside of this caste that they are tired of, that it be someone who has never been a minister or been a member of this elite. And now, of course, the parliamentary blocs are scrambling to try to select a representative, but they're also movement amongst the protesters themselves to perhaps suggest names. So this is what's taking place on the ground right now.
If you can talk about what this means for the U.S. You have President Trump going to Afghanistan on Thanksgiving Day. And you have Afghanistan, the U.S. invaded in 2001. Bush invades Iraq in 2003. Do you see a total rejection of what has happened since U.S. invaded Iraq, what this means? Also, the extent of Iranian influence right now in Iraq. You have The Intercept that just released there's hundreds and hundreds of pages of Iranian documents, the first time ever you see from the Iranian government's point of view the level of infiltration of all aspects of Iran. This coming after the 2003 invasion. Of course, before, under Saddam Hussein, Iran and Iraq were at war for years.
I mean, these protests, while the anti-Iranian sentiment, which is completely understandable given the Iranian influence inside Iraq, but these protests are about reclaiming Iraqi sovereignty as well. So while in the mainstream media in the West, there is so much focus on Iran, there have been, the voices of the protesters have been very clear. They're against Turkish interference, they're against US interference, they're against any interference from neighboring Gulf states and Iran, of course, because of its power within the political elite. But it's a total rejection of the system that has prevailed since 2003. Now, whenever there is a vacuum or whenever there is a formation of a new government, in the back channels and backstage, there is always Iranian and US interference, of course, because both countries are interested in pushing a candidate that's more answerable to their interests. So while, of course, on the popular level, this is a rejection of the entire political system, it should be no surprise that the United States and Iran are trying to push a candidate who would be favored by their own geopolitical interests.
And the youth of the protesters, and we spoke about this last week. A number of the protesters, were not even born in 2003.
Yes, I mean, this is also what I said last week, but it bears repeating in that most of these protesters are unencumbered and are not concerned with some of these old binaries and these old questions that oftentimes, or these old accusations and fears, stoking fires of fear from the return of the Ba'ath or from ISIS or from this and that. As my friend Ghaith mentioned, a lot of these youth have credibility because they themselves fought to defend the country and to liberate parts of Iraq from ISIS. So they speak with credibility, and they've come to the realization now, and it's been accumulating for many years, that this political system is incapable of producing anything. The political machine only produces violence, corruption, and it's unable also to protect its own citizens. And there is this rampant influence by these militias, these masked men who are going around and shooting innocent protesters. So the protesters know that this is one chance that comes in a generation, that staying in the streets and remaining peaceful is the only way to put more pressure to change the entire political system, not just one figure replaced by another similar figure, having a new election law and having a new constitution that does not leave the country beholden to the power of ethno-sectarian parties and the patronage system.
And Ghaith Abdulahad, if you can talk about what you see happening next, and also who is held accountable for the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of protesters who've been killed, well over 400 it looks like at this point.
Yes, but just before that, if I can just say one thing regarding what Sinan was just saying. I mean, it's true. I mean, if you see the demonstration, if you see the calls in the street, it's rejecting both American influence and Iranian influence, because both countries are held responsible in the streets of Iraq, they're seen as responsible for establishing and empowering this corrupt political system. The Iranians are rejected because they're backing these militias, while all these politicians who rule Baghdad now and the parties came with the Americans' invasion. So that's the first thing. What you see in the ground, I mean, you see two powers now facing each other. Power one, which is the people in the streets. The people in the streets are, as Sinan was saying, as the demonstrators were saying, are not going to accept just a make-up change to the system. They want a whole change to the political process, and their demands are very logical, and it's very sensible. They want a new independent prime minister, they want a new election law, a new election committee, and UN-supervised elections to lead to a redrawing of the constitution. These are very basic. But then you have, on the other hand, all the members of the parliaments, all the political parties, and all their militias. They have been siphoning billions of dollars out of Iraq's budget in the last 15 years. Are they willing to give up all of this wealth, all these sources of income, and the powers of the militias, the weapons? Are they going to give up all these things easily? No. So what we are seeing now, the people are feeling victorious because they've achieved step one, toppling the prime minister, but the confrontation is going to go for weeks, if not months, to come.
Sinan Antoun, you're a translator, you're an author, you're a poet. If you can talk about the poem you chose to share with us today.
I mean, the poem is about martyrs, which I wrote 3 years ago during the Syrian uprising and its aftermath. But one of the protesters who were killed in the early days happened to be a friend of mine, Safa As-Sarai, who's now become one of the icons of this. And we corresponded for many years, and I met him in my last trip to Baghdad. And he's an exemplary figure of what types of protesters are. A very young, talented Iraqi artist and poet from a working class background who studied engineering but couldn't find a job, and who was always at the forefront of all of these protesters. And he was killed on the 28th with one of these canisters, these war-grade canisters. But this is just an excerpt from a poem that's called Psalm that I'd love to read, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. Martyrs do not go to paradise. They leaf through the heavenly book, each in their own way, as a bird, a star, or a cloud. They appear to us every day and cry for us. We who are still in this hell, they try to extinguish with their blood. And I want to read it because of the countless young men and women who have been killed only for protesting peacefully, and the attempts of the regime and of its agents, frankly, to disfigure the memory of some of these activists nowadays on social media.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Sinan Antoun, poet, novelist, translator, scholar, born and raised in Baghdad, Iraq, now an associate professor at New York University. His most recent novel, The Book of Collateral Damage. Ghaith Abdulahad, speaking to us from Baghdad, Iraq, correspondent for The Guardian newspaper. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As President Trump heads to London for a NATO summit, we turn now to look at the upcoming British elections. The December 12th election pits right-wing Prime Minister Boris Johnson against the Socialist Labour Party leader, Jeremy Corbyn. Corbyn recently unveiled an ambitious election manifesto promising to transform Britain and resuscitate its public sector. The plan proposed a $100 billion tax increase on the wealthy to fund investment in infrastructure, as well as increase spending on education and health care. This is Corbyn speaking in the central English city of Birmingham last month.
Labour's manifesto is a manifesto for hope. That is what this document is. A manifesto that will bring real change. A manifesto that's full of popular policies that the political establishment has blocked for a generation. But you can't have it. At least that's what the most powerful people in Britain and their supporters want you to believe.
Last month, Labour leader Corbyn and Prime Minister Johnson sparred on Brexit during a live television debate. This clip begins with Johnson.
Mr. Corbyn is trying to conceal the void at the heart of his Brexit policy and refusing to answer the question of which side he would take. Because the public have a right to know.
Thank you, Mr. Corbyn. Just very briefly,
I've made the position clear. We will have a referendum, we will have negotiation, and we will abide by that result.
Let's be, the union is, of course, the most important thing. Just to answer the question straight up. The union, and it's a fantastic thing, for the chaotic coalition that he would comprise.
Okay, thank you. Let's allow him to respond. Can you rule it out?
There's 9 years of chaotic coalitions already.
Okay.
That was British Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn and Prime Minister Boris Johnson debating last month. Well, I recently spoke with Tariq Ali in London, the noted historian, activist, filmmaker, author and editor of the New Left Review. I began by asking Tariq Ali to elaborate on what's happening in this snap election.
Amy, the first thing you have to understand is that the British Conservative Party has effectively been taken over by the extreme right wing inside that party. And they are waging a very right-wing campaign. On Brexit, their own position has changed from when they were threatening a no-deal Brexit to now accepting a compromise with the European Union. And Boris Johnson has decided to centre the election on Brexit because he thinks he can convince people that every other politician in the land, especially Jeremy Corbyn, will never push it through. The line Corbyn has taken is that whatever deal he achieves with the European Union will be put to the people, and they will be given a choice again. Now, this is unpopular with some of his own supporters, but that's the deal. However, what Corbyn has been arguing is that he refuses to fight the election on Brexit or no Brexit. He says this election has to be fought on real social and economic issues. And this is why he unleashed this radical social democratic program at Birmingham not so long ago, which is the most radical program Labour has had for a very long time indeed, for many, many decades. Renationalising the railway industry, taking back control of water so it's no longer in the hands of the privatisers, making sure that the National Health Service is properly funded and that the privatization measures which were infiltrated into this health service by both Tony Blair and David Cameron will come to an end. Free higher education for all, etc., etc. It's a radical reforming manifesto. And this is now what the debate is going to be about. And interestingly enough, amongst the undecided people, Corbyn scored a victory with that television debate, which you just showed an excerpt from, not one of the great confrontations in British political history, but in any case, he scored well with unattached voters. So he knows that there's everything to play for. And Corbyn is at his best when he's campaigning, when he's talking to ordinary people. He hates mainstream television and how it distorts politics and how it manipulates, and who can blame him? So he's at his best when he's talking to people on the streets or big meetings or answering questions from real people. And we hope that he will become the largest party in Parliament, if not something more than that. I mean, the campaign is now, after a couple of weeks, beginning to pick up. And when I last spoke to Julian Assange, and I said to him, "Do you see any hope at all, Julian?" He said, "The only hope is a Corbyn government." Tariq, because he said, I can't depend on the English judiciary. So on many, many levels, civil liberties, women's rights, racism, I think this is the campaign that we're going to see. And whether it enthuses enough people, who knows?
Tariq, I wanted to play for you British Prime Minister Boris Johnson's response to the Labour Party's election manifesto that the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn just unveiled. He was speaking, Prime Minister Johnson was speaking during a campaign visit to a building site in Bedford, England.
None of it has any credibility whatever, because the whole at the heart of Labour's manifesto, this was the moment, it was lights, camera, action, Corbyn comes centre stage, drum roll, and he completely misses his cue. Because what we want to know is what is his plan to deliver Brexit, and what's the deal he wants to do, and which side would he vote on that deal, and we still don't know. Until we have answers to those questions, until we get Brexit done, none of this carries any economic credibility whatever.
So that's Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Tariq Ali, your response.
Well, I mean, it's not surprising. Jeremy predicted this would be his response. And the answer to Boris Johnson is this. Even the long years Britain has been in the European Union, these policies have slowly been developing. If Britain is or isn't in the European Union, from this point of view, it doesn't matter. These are Labour's policies, and they're going to push them through regardless of what happens in relation to Brexit. The money is there. The rich are there, the billionaires to be taxed. This is something on which Corbyn is not going to retreat. And quite honestly, it's Corbyn's election manifesto is a common sense manifesto, unless you're completely on the right or sort of racist or whatever. I think it's not going to be easy for Boris to totally demolish this case. That's the big thing which Labour is banking on.
So talk about Brexit and talk about Boris Johnson's view and Jeremy Corbyn's view, and what people will be basing their decision on in the snap election.
Well, Boris's view is as follows, that there was a referendum agreed to by all the political parties. In this referendum, the pro-European Union parties lost, and a majority of the British public, the highest number of people to vote for anything in this country ever, over 17 million people, over 50%, voted to quit the European Union. And governments have been prevaricating. But the point is this is true, by the way, it's not false. But this referendum was pushed through by the Conservative Party to deal. David Cameron thought it was one way of getting rid of Boris and his gang, because he was convinced the British people would vote to remain in the European Union. Theresa May, who succeeded Cameron, is also pro-EU, and she wasted a lot of time in getting a deal agreed. So Boris's campaign for Conservative voters is very simple. The people voted, the politicians obstructed. It's a people versus parliament issue. He's not spelt it out in these terms yet, but that is what lies behind the thing. Corbyn's position is this. It's 3 years now. People are fed up of this business. We should settle it for once and for all. So we should have a new referendum to see if people still believe in what they voted for 3 years ago. And in this referendum, they will be offered two choices: Labour's Brexit deal, or a choice, if they've changed their minds, to remain in the European Union. Now, many people, including Labour supporters, feel that Corbyn should be defending, and they voted for Brexit, especially working-class voters in the north of England, that Corbyn should just implement it. His view is, time has passed, we should have a new referendum. The way the campaign is fought will determine what people think. Amy, and so far Labour's made its position clear on Brexit, which obviously Johnson doesn't like, but is now fighting the campaign on issues central to the everyday lives of working people and ordinary people in this country. Ken Loach's latest film shows how zero hours and what neoliberalism has done to the lives of young people. And everyone knows this. This is the experience of people in most parts of the country. So if this message can be got across over the next few weeks, I'm moderately optimistic. I think Corbyn could win. The interesting thing is that the Liberal Party, the Liberal Democrats, are waging such a right-wing anti-Corbyn campaign that now they've said that they'll join a coalition with the Conservatives, Boris Johnson, if Boris just agrees to another referendum, which is very unlikely. And the Liberal Democrat leader, Jo Swinson, though I've nicknamed her Jo Strangelove, attacks Corbyn for not saying in public that if Prime Minister, he would press the nuclear button. Saying he's a pacifist, he's this and he's that, making a nuclear war one of the minor issues in this campaign. So, I mean, I think she will lose votes for saying that, and I think she might even lose her own seat in Scotland, which is very hostile to nuclear weapons. But it's a crazy campaign, the Liberal.
I wanted to also ask you about something else that came up in the debate between Johnson and Corbyn, and that's the whole issue of Prince Andrew. Prince Andrew saying Wednesday he'll withdraw from public duties amidst mounting public anger over his longtime friendship with the now deceased serial sexual predator Jeffrey Epstein. In a BBC interview that aired Sunday, Prince Andrew denied accusations by Virginia Roberts Giuffre, who says she was sexually trafficked by Epstein and forced to have sex with the prince when she was 17 years old. A photo released by Giuffre shows Prince Andrew standing beside her with his hand around her bare stomach, with Epstein's longtime confidant, Ghislaine Maxwell, in the background. I just wanted to go to Prince Andrew in BBC when he was asked if he was sorry for his longtime relationship with Epstein.
Do you regret the whole friendship with Epstein?
Now, still not. And the reason being is that the people that I met and the opportunities that I was given to learn either by him or because of him, were actually very useful.
This was just an astounding response that Buckingham Palace is trying to take back now, given the allegations against Jeffrey Epstein as a serial sexual predator and sex trafficker. So I wanted to turn to a part of the live TV debate between Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his rival, Jeremy Corbyn. The moderator asked if the monarchy is fit for purpose. This is Corbyn's response, followed by Johnson's.
Is the monarchy fit for purpose? Jeremy Corbyn.
Needs a bit of improvement.
Mr. Johnson.
The institution of the monarchy is beyond reproach.
Before we discuss Prince Andrew, I think we should discuss the victims that are there because of what Epstein was doing. And I think there are very, very serious questions that must be answered, and nobody should be above the law.
I think all our sympathies should be obviously with the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, and the law must certainly take its course.
Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn responding to this question, with Jeremy Corbyn, talking about the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, and Prince Andrew's response that he could not be sorry for his longtime relationship with Jeffrey Epstein because he'd learned so much from him. Tariq Ali.
I wonder what Prince Andrew actually learned from Epstein, Amy. It's I heard this interview, and it's puzzling. Did he learn the benefits of paedophilia? Did he learn what it is to assault young women who've been bought or brought in to serve these people? I mean, what that interview revealed is that Andrew is like many other rich people, stupid, wanting more money, more greed, thinking they're entitled to do what they want with young women or young men or whoever. I mean, they feel no one can touch them. They're untouchables. And when they're exposed, then they squirm. But while others involved have apologized or tried to, this fellow didn't even attempt anything like that. He didn't know what to say. I mean, I'm sure he was briefed, he was taught what to do. There were divisions within Buckingham Palace as to whether he should do the interview at all. One of his people resigned because she said, you shouldn't be doing this interview. And then he comes up, why? Why do you want to bother? I mean, quite honestly, the monarchy is long past its sell-by date, and I think after Her Majesty the Queen passes away, there will be a debate on whether to continue this farce or not. I mean, it's a tourist attraction, so that lots of people can come from the United States and watch them, guards dressed in red marching up and down, and that could be organized as a virtual thing. You don't need a living monarchy to do that.
What is Jeremy Corbyn's view of the monarchy? Does he think it should be abolished?
Well, about several years ago, Jeremy's mentor, Tony Benn, proposed a bill in Parliament to democratize Britain, which was co-signed by Jeremy. And the first item on the bill was that Parliament should abolish the crown, i.e. the monarchy. It should democratize the judiciary. It should abolish the House of Lords. Jeremy is a signed-up member to Benn's democratic campaigns, and I think they haven't had time to deal with this as yet, but it's a bit sad that Tony Benn is no longer with us, because he would have pushed this democratic agenda through. And at its heart lies the monarchy and the House of Lords, and it's high time they were abolished. They will be sooner or later, but it's taken a long time.
Tariq Ali, the noted historian, activist, and author. When we come back, he talks about uprisings around the globe. Stay with us.
Work all night and a drink a rum. Daylight come and we want go home. Stack banana till the morning come. Daylight come and we want go home. Come, Mr. Tallyman, tally me banana. Daylight come and we want go home. Come, Mr. Tallyman, tally me banana. Daylight come and we want go home. Live 6 foot, 7 foot, 8 foot bunch. Daylight come and we want go home. 6 foot, 7 foot, 8 foot bunch. Daylight come and we want go home. Day is a day, oh. Daylight come and we want go home. Day is a day.
Deo, the Banana Boat song by Harry Belafonte, the writer of the song Irving Burgee, died at the age of 95 on Friday in Brooklyn. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman as we continue our conversation with Tariq Ali, the historian, activist, filmmaker, author, editor of the New Left Review. I asked Tariq Ali about the significance of the uprisings that are happening around the world, from Chile to Lebanon to Iraq and beyond.
Well, I think it's extremely significant because what it reveals is a new generation completely alienated from the political structures of their societies. In most cases, it's the case in Chile, where Sylvie Bachelet, the socialist president for 2 terms, did nothing to transform, reform, and get rid of Pinochet's structures, political, socio-economic structures in that country.
Although
and
Michelle Bachelet, of course, was a
saying.
victim of Pinochet. Michelle Bachelet was a victim of Pinochet. Her mother, her father.
She was, of course she was, which is why she should have acted on this. I mean, it's a real tragedy. So the protesters are not involved with any political party in Chile because they don't like what Bachelet did when she wasted 2 terms and not doing anything and basically following the U.S. lead in foreign policy. A U.S. which was centrally involved in the Chilean coup d'etat, as you know better than most. In Lebanon, it's the same thing. It's heartening to see the Lebanese demonstrations in Beirut. Young people, Christians, Shia Muslims, Sunni Muslims, Druze, people of all different denominations marching together and saying we want to get rid of all of them. And the all of them they're talking about is corrupt politicians, their oligarchies, their crookedness, what they're doing to the country. So they want change too. And in Iraq, people are just fed up that, you know, nothing much has happened for them since the occupation. They live in dire conditions, and many of their parents and grandparents remind them of what Iraq used to be. Despite Saddam Hussein's atrocities, they say life was better under him. This is very common now in Iraq and in Libya, Amy. So the effect it has here, young people are saying it's the Corbyn campaign. If Jeremy Corbyn doesn't win, I think you will see trouble here. You've seen it in France with the Gilets jaunes movement, the yellow vests, where the repression was horrendous. We now have got the figures, 10,000 arrests, people shot with gas in the eye. The head of the French health service recently blogged, pleading with the government, please stop firing in young people's eyes. We've had to remove one eye completely, and many, many people are now suffering. So it's not simply that it's happening elsewhere, it's happening in Europe as well. And of course, in your country, you have these huge gatherings. I mean, 26,000 people gathering in Brooklyn to hear Bernie Sanders. This sort of thing doesn't happen every day in an election campaign. So I think underneath the surface and above it, there is a lot of rumbling.
And in your country, I mean, in Britain, you have thousands of people taking to the streets, particularly around the climate crisis, not only when President Trump made that state visit to London, but you have Extinction Rebellion.
Yeah, that has been huge, very well organized, unpredictable. Attempts to delegitimize it have failed because the courts have ruled that the police have no right to ban these demonstrations, which is one of the few legal victories a movement has won in this country in recent years. So that is happening here. And, you know, let's hope it ties in with the election campaign. I think the figures are that over 1 million people have registered between the ages of 18 and 34. They've kept to the date, they've registered, so I hope that that helps. It would be amazing. Also, Amy, if Corbyn wins and begins to implement the program, it will have a big effect globally. If it can be done in Britain, why can't it be done in France? Why can't it be done in the United States? Why can't it be done in country X or Y or Z? It will show that it is possible to reverse all the damage inflicted by the neoliberal system, its economic policies, its wars, etc. Corbyn would be the first prime minister of this country who has been an anti-war activist and president of the Stop the War campaign for some years. So that is one reason the right is so upset, and the establishment has been trying to destabilize him, and this absurd accusation of him being anti-Semitic has been thrown into the ring by right-wing and liberal Zionists, which has unfortunately had an impact. But, you know, people are fighting back, including large numbers of Jewish activists from Jewish Voices for Labour. But they've hurled every possible charge you can imagine at him. He's a terrorist, he's an anti-Semite, he's a communist, he's going to be like Stalin. You cannot imagine it outside this country, what they've thrown at him. And he's come back fighting. Well, this is probably his last fight politically to win this election, and let's hope he succeeds.
Tariq Ali, the noted historian, activist, and author, speaking to us from London. He's co-editor of the new book, In Defense of Julian Assange. To see our full interview with Tariq Ali, you can go to DemocracyNow.org. Well, we'll be broadcasting from Stockholm, Sweden, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, where the Brazilian indigenous leader Davi Kopanawa and the Western Sahara human rights activist Aminatou Haidar will be receiving the Right Livelihood Award. Then we go to Madrid, Spain, for the UN Climate Summit on Friday and continuing all next week. That does it for the show. Democracy Now! Is produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermin Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Tarina Nadura, Taymari Astudio, Adriana Contreras, and Maria Taracena. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.